The Gilded Bean was not a coffee shop. It was a sanctuary carved from marble and dark mahogany, a silent cathedral dedicated to the worship of capital. The air inside hummed with a unique frequency, a blend of the rich, earthy aroma of single-origin Ethiopian beans and the intangible scent of old money, leather, and ambition. Sunlight struggled to pierce the tall, tinted windows, catching in the facets of crystal chandeliers and glinting off the polished silver of 1,000 whispered deals. Here, fortunes were made and dismantled over $5 a sip espressos, and the clientele moved with the quiet, predatory grace of those who owned the world. And in the center of this opulent stage, a ghost in a crisp, black apron moved with practiced efficiency. Elara Vance was a part of the machinery, her existence a silent, efficient hum beneath the roar of power. Her hands, steady and sure, performed the familiar ballet of the barista, tamping espresso grounds, steaming milk to a perfect velvety microfoam, and wiping down the gleaming counters until they reflected the distorted constellations of the overhead lights. She was, to the titans of industry she served, utterly invisible, a functional component of the scenery, and that was precisely how she needed it to be. To the patrons of the Gilded Bean, Elara was merely the hands that crafted their morning caffeine ritual. They never saw the universe that churned behind her calm, professional gaze. They could not hear the echoes of courtroom arguments in her mind as she listened to their orders, nor could they feel the phantom weight of a corporate law textbook in her hands as she carried a tray of porcelain cups. Her memory, a fortress of legal precedent and statutory clauses, was a secret she guarded more fiercely than her own heart. Just a few years ago, her world had been the hushed, hallowed halls of Stanford Law, where she was not just a student, but a prodigy. The language of securities law was her native tongue, the intricate dance of mergers and acquisitions, a puzzle she could solve with breathtaking clarity. That world had shattered on the day her father's laughter was replaced by the rhythmic, sterile beep of a hospital monitor. His small, brilliant tech company, his life's work, had been devoured in a hostile takeover, a brutal asset-stripping maneuver that left him with nothing but a broken spirit, and a stroke that stole his voice and his mobility. Elara had traded her future for his present, abandoning her degree to become his caregiver, her life now dictated by medical bills and the quiet, agonizing duty of love. This job, this apron, this invisibility, it was all for him. The delicate equilibrium of the cafe shifted with the opening of the heavy glass door. It wasn't a sound, but a subtle change in the room's atmospheric pressure, a collective, instinctual recognition of a greater predator entering the ecosystem. Marcus Thorne did not walk into a room, he conquered it. He was a man sculpted from arrogance and bespoke tailoring. His suit, a shade of charcoal so dark it seemed to absorb the light around him. A Patek Philippe watch gleamed on his wrist, not as a time-telling device, but as a statement of his net worth. His eyes, two chips of polished granite, swept across the room with a dismissive air, cataloging assets and dismissing liabilities. He saw not people, but pieces on a chessboard of his own design. He settled into a plush leather armchair, his associate, a nervous young man clutching a tablet, scurrying to sit opposite him. The manager of the Gilded Bean materialized at his side, his posture a study in deference, his smile strained and obsequious. Thorne waved a hand, a gesture of pure dismissal, and the manager vanished. Elara felt the familiar cold knot tighten in her stomach. She had served men like him 1,000 times, men who radiated a casual cruelty born from the absolute certainty that the rules of common decency did not apply to them. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of this gilded cage in New York City, but first we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below and be sure to subscribe to join our community for more stories where justice is served. The air around Thorne's table grew thick with a palpable tension. He wasn't having a meeting, he was holding a court of inquiry, and the young man opposite him was the one on trial. The intern, whose name Elara would later learn was Leo, was visibly trembling. His face, pale and slick with a nervous sweat, was a mask of pure terror. Thorne's voice was not loud, but it cut through the quiet hum of the cafe like a shard of ice. He tapped a perfectly manicured finger on the tablet in front of Leo, his nail making a sharp, accusatory click against the glass. He spoke of profit margins, of due diligence, of a single, catastrophic typo in a financial projection that had, in his telling, nearly derailed a multi-million-dollar acquisition. He dissected the young man's incompetence with the detached precision of a surgeon, his words dripping with condescending jargon designed to confuse and belittle. The humiliation was a slow, methodical affair, a public execution of a young man's confidence. Thorne leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. He questioned Leo's intelligence, his education, his very right to breathe the same rarefied air as him. A deep, crimson flush crept up Leo's neck, his Adam's apple bobbing convulsively as he struggled to form a defense that would never be heard. Finally, the dam of his composure broke. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, then another. He bowed his head, his shoulders shaking with silent, mortified sobs. The patrons of the Gilded Bean averted their eyes, feigning interest in their newspapers or phones, their silence a form of complicity. They were lions in a pride, and they would not interfere with the alpha's brutal display of dominance, but Elara watched, and the sight of those silent tears ignited a cold, protective fury deep within her. The professional mask she wore every day suddenly felt suffocating. The black apron, a straitjacket of forced servitude. Every instinct screamed for invisibility. To keep her head down, to focus on the rhythmic hiss of the espresso machine, was to keep her job. To keep her job was to keep the lights on in her father's sterile, quiet room, to afford the medications that kept him comfortable, to pay the nurses who cared for him while she was here. Her father's well-being was a fragile ecosystem dependent entirely on her ability to remain unseen, unheard, and unoffending. The risk of intervention was catastrophic, but then the image of her own father's face, in the days after his company was destroyed, swam into her vision. She remembered the bewildered hurt in his eyes, the way his powerful hands had trembled, the crushing weight of a humiliation that had broken not just his finances, but his spirit. Leo's silent tears were a reflection of her father's unspoken pain. In that moment, the choice was no longer a choice, it was an imperative. The part of her that was a daughter, the part of her that still believed in justice, the part of her that had once sworn an oath to uphold it, eclipsed the part of her that was a barista. A quiet resolve settled over her, solidifying the fear in her stomach into something hard and unyielding. She moved from behind the counter, her steps measured and deliberate. Her spine was straight, her chin level, her movements economical and devoid of hesitation. In her hand, she carried a small tray with a glass of water and a folded, crisp white napkin. She approached the table not as a servant but as an equal, her presence a calm island in the turbulent wake of Thorne's cruelty. She placed the glass of water gently in front of Leo, her gesture a small, silent act of solidarity. She didn't look at the crying young man. Instead, her eyes, clear and direct, found Marcus Thorne's. For the first time, he was forced to truly see her, not as a functionary, but as a person. He looked up, his expression a mixture of irritation and utter disbelief. Who was this nonentity, this part of the furniture, to dare interrupt his demonstration of power? His gaze was cold and dismissive, the look of a man swatting away a fly, a predator assessing an irrelevant obstacle that had foolishly wandered into his path. The entire cafe seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Thorne let out a short, incredulous laugh, a sound devoid of any warmth. He turned to his associate, a cruel smirk playing on his lips, gesturing toward Elara as if she were an exhibit. He decided, in that moment of supreme arrogance, to make her the new object of his lesson. To demonstrate just how vast the chasm was between his world and hers, he began to speak again, continuing his business discussion as if she were not there, but now directing it at her. He started outlining the intricate and highly illegal details of a new corporate raid he was planning. He spoke of a leveraged buyout, of devaluing a target company's stock through a coordinated short-selling campaign, of using shell corporations to obscure ownership and bypass federal disclosure requirements. He used complex financial and legal terminology like a weapon, each syllable a calculated blow meant to reinforce her supposed ignorance. It was a stunningly reckless display, a confession delivered in plain sight, born from the absolute, unshakable conviction that the woman serving him coffee was no more capable of understanding him than the marble floor beneath her feet. He leaned back in his chair, the picture of untouchable power, and delivered the final, fatal blow. His eyes met Ilara's, and his smirk widened into a sneer of pure contempt. "Don't worry," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It's not like the help could possibly comprehend the nuances of a leveraged buyout." The insult hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The associate chuckled nervously. The other patrons shifted uncomfortably. But Ilara did not flinch. She did not look away. She did not retreat. Instead, a profound stillness settled over her. The ambient noise of the cafe, the clinking of porcelain, the hiss of the steamer, all of it muffled and receded, until the only sound was the slow, powerful drumbeat of her own heart. A cold, crystalline clarity washed over her, sharpening her focus until the entire world narrowed to the arrogant, sneering face of Marcus Thorne. The barista was gone. The caregiver was gone. In their place, something long dormant, something brilliant and formidable, had finally awakened. The courtroom of her mind was now in session. The insult, a final venomous dart, found its mark not in her pride, but in the deepest well of her memory. For a fraction of a second, the world outside fell away, and she was back in the cavernous, book-lined halls of the Stanford Law Library, the scent of aging paper and ambition filling her lungs. The words, leveraged buyout, were not a mystery to her. They were the title of the third chapter of her thesis, a subject she had dissected with a surgical precision that had left her professors in awe. The cold knot of fear in her stomach, the one that had dictated her every move for the past 3 years, did not dissolve. Instead, it underwent a profound alchemical change, transforming from a mass of anxious dread into a solid core of glacial resolve. The fawning, invisible barista who had clocked in that morning ceased to exist. In her place stood Ilara Vance, Juris Doctor candidate, a mind forged in the crucible of corporate law, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the familiar, formidable weight of her own intellect settle back into her bones. Her posture shifted, an almost imperceptible change, but one that radiated a sudden, shocking authority. Her spine straightened, her shoulders squared, and when she lifted her chin, her eyes were no longer the deferential, downcast gaze of a service worker, but the clear, piercing stare of a prosecutor. She took a single, deliberate step forward, her movements now devoid of the hurried efficiency of her job. There was a grace to her stillness, a powerful quiet that seemed to suck the very sound from the air around Thorne's table. She placed the porcelain cup and saucer on the dark mahogany, the sound a soft, definitive click in the sudden, profound silence of the cafe. The patrons, who had moments before been masters of feigned ignorance, were now utterly captivated, their conversations dying in their throats, their eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and anticipation. They sensed the shift in the atmosphere, the same way animals sense an earthquake seconds before the ground begins to shake. Marcus Thorne, still basking in the glow of his own perceived wit, looked up at her, an impatient scowl forming on his lips, ready to dismiss her for her insolence. But the expression froze on his face when he met her gaze. He saw not a chastened employee, but an equal. No, not an equal. He saw a judge, and for the first time in his gilded life, a sliver of genuine, unadulterated uncertainty pierced the thick armor of his arrogance. He opened his mouth to speak, to deliver another crushing blow, but no sound came out. The power dynamic had been irrevocably broken, and he was no longer in control. Ilara's voice, when it came, was not loud, but it possessed a resonant clarity that carried to every corner of the opulent room. It was a voice that had been trained for hours in mock trial, a voice designed to command attention and convey absolute certainty. It was calm, measured, and utterly devastating. She did not raise it, for she did not need to. Her words were the weapon, each one sharpened to a razor's edge. She looked directly into Marcus Thorne's eyes, her expression unreadable, a placid mask that concealed the roaring furnace of her mind. She began to speak, and the world seemed to hold its breath. "I believe," she said, her tone as cool and smooth as the marble floor, "the specific nuance you are referring to falls under Section 13D of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. The legal citation landed in the dead silence of the cafe with the force of a gavel strike. It was precise, academic, and so wildly out of place that it created a moment of pure cognitive dissonance for everyone listening. Thorne's face, which had been a mask of smug contempt, now registered a flicker of genuine, slack-jawed confusion. It was as if the coffee cup she had just placed on his table had begun to recite Shakespeare. The words were familiar to him, of course, but hearing them from her was an impossibility, a tear in the fabric of his meticulously ordered universe. She did not pause to allow him to recover. She pressed her advantage with the relentless logic of a closing argument. "That particular section," she continued, her voice unwavering, "requires any party acquiring more than 5% of a company's stock to file a public disclosure with the Securities and Exchange Commission within 10 days. It's a foundational tenet of market transparency, designed specifically to prevent the kind of predatory accumulation you just outlined." She began to dismantle his entire plan, piece by illegal piece, translating his self-important jargon into the simple, brutal language of criminal conspiracy. "The shell corporations you mentioned used to acquire shares in smaller, untraceable blocks to avoid triggering that 5% threshold? That isn't a clever loophole. That's a textbook definition of a parking violation, a form of securities fraud. The coordinated short-selling campaign to artificially devalue the stock before the acquisition? That's not aggressive business. That's market manipulation, a felony." She spoke with an unnerving fluency, the complex legal concepts flowing from her as naturally as breath, each statement a brick in the wall of his own guilt. The barista was gone, replaced by a scholar, and she was holding a masterclass in his own damnation. The transformation in Marcus Thorne was a sight to behold. The carefully constructed edifice of his superiority, built over a lifetime of unchecked power and sycophantic praise, crumbled into dust in a matter of seconds. The smug, condescending sneer melted from his face, replaced by a pallor of sickly disbelief. A vein began to throb violently in his temple, a visible testament to the war raging inside his head between his ego and the undeniable truth of her words. His eyes, once cold and dismissive, were now wide with a dawning horror, the look of a king who has just been checked by a pawn. He was not merely being corrected, he was being systematically and publicly unraveled by someone he had considered less than human, a background element in the grand drama of his life. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating wave that washed over him, leaving him speechless and exposed. He was Marcus Thorne, a titan of the universe, and he was being lectured on securities law by the help. The sheer, galling absurdity of it was a poison for which he had no antidote. He was naked, and the entire world was watching. The silence that followed her final, damning statement was absolute. It was a heavy, weighted silence, filled with the unspoken shock of every person in the room. Even the espresso machine seemed to have fallen quiet, as if in reverence to the magnitude of what had just occurred. Leo, the young intern, stared at Ilara with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe, his tears forgotten, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning hope. The other patrons, the minor gods of finance and industry, were frozen in place, their lattes growing cold in their hands, their eyes darting from the stone-faced woman in the black apron to the visibly imploding billionaire. They had come to the Gilded Bean for coffee and a sense of their own importance, but they were now witnesses to something far more elemental, the complete and utter annihilation of a man's arrogance by the quiet, unexpected power of knowledge. Ilara simply stood there, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her work done. She had not raised her voice, she had not insulted him. She had simply held up a mirror, forcing him to see the ugly criminal reality of his own reflection, and it had broken him. The paralysis that had gripped Marcus Thorne finally shattered, and the broken pieces reassembled themselves not into shock, but into a form of rage so pure and so venomous, it seemed to radiate a palpable heat. The sickly pallor of his skin was replaced by a dark mottled flush that crawled up his neck and consumed his face. His lips peeled back from his teeth in a silent snarl, and his hands, resting on the table, clenched into white-knuckled fists. The humiliation had found its outlet in a torrent of undiluted fury. He was a cornered animal, and his only instinct was to lash out, to destroy the source of his shame. He surged to his feet, the heavy armchair scraping violently against the marble floor, the sound a shriek of metallic protest in the otherwise silent room. His eyes, now two burning coals of incandescent hatred, locked onto Ilara's. He did not see a person. He saw an unforgivable insult to his very existence, an error in the universe that needed to be corrected, to be erased with extreme prejudice. His entire being was now focused on a single, all-consuming goal, her utter and immediate destruction. He did not deign to speak to her directly. To do so now would be to acknowledge her as a worthy adversary, a concession his shattered ego could not possibly afford. Instead, he treated her as a problem to be solved, an inconvenience to be removed. He pulled his phone from the inner pocket of his suit jacket, his movements jerky and violent, a stark contrast to his usual air of languid control. He jabbed a single number on the speed dial, his thumb pressing into the glass screen with enough force to crack it. He lifted the phone to his ear, his malevolent gaze never leaving Ilara's face. The call was answered almost instantly. "Thorne," he barked into the receiver, his voice a low, dangerous growl that promised retribution. "I'm at your Fifth Avenue location. The Barista. I want her gone. Not tomorrow. Not in an hour. I want her gone right now." He paused, listening for a moment, a cruel, triumphant smirk beginning to twist his lips. "Yes," he hissed, "I am very aware of how much business my firm does with you. Make it happen." He ended the call with a final, vicious tap of his thumb, the silence that followed ringing with the finality of a death sentence. The manager of the Gilded Bean, a man named Mr. Davies, whose entire professional life was a study in appeasement, materialized from his office as if summoned by a dark incantation. His face was the color of old parchment, and his eyes were wide with the frantic terror of a man who saw his career, his mortgage, and his children's college fund flashing before his eyes. He scurried toward the table, his movements a pathetic, shuffling apology. He did not look at Ilara, could not bring himself to meet the eyes of the woman he was about to sacrifice on the altar of Thorne's ego. He directed his terrified, stammering words to the floor. "Ilara," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. I'm so sorry. Corporate has a zero-tolerance policy. Customer complaints. I have to ask you to hand over your apron and leave the premises immediately." Each word was a betrayal, a small death to his own conscience, but the unspoken threat from Marcus Thorne, who stood watching with the smug satisfaction of a victorious tyrant, was a far more powerful motivator than any sense of loyalty or justice. The system was working exactly as it was designed to. Ilara felt a strange sense of detachment wash over her, a calm acceptance of the inevitable. The fiery satisfaction of her victory was now being cooled by the harsh, icy reality of its consequences. She had known this would happen. She had made a choice. And this was the price. There was no anger toward Mr. Davies. He was just another cog in the machine, a man trapped by the same forces that had trapped her. She simply nodded once, a gesture of quiet, unassailable dignity. She turned away from the scene of her triumph and her execution, and walked back behind the polished counter. Her movements were fluid and unhurried. She reached behind her back and untied the strings of the black apron, the uniform that had been both her prison and her shield for 3 long years. She folded it neatly, smoothing out the wrinkles with a steady hand, and placed it on the counter next to the gleaming espresso machine. It was a final, symbolic act of surrender, but also one of liberation. She was no longer a barista, she was unemployed, and for the first time in a very long time, she was free. She walked toward the exit, her back straight, her head held high. She could feel the stares of every single person in the cafe, a mixture of pity, admiration, and fear. She did not look at any of them. She did not look at Leo, whose face was a mask of horrified disbelief. She did not give Marcus Thorne the satisfaction of seeing a single flicker of regret or fear in her eyes. She pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped out into the chaotic symphony of a New York City afternoon. The cool air was a shock to her system, a sudden bracing slap of reality. The sounds of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, the distant wail of a siren, it all rushed in to fill the void left by the oppressive silence of the cafe. And in that moment, the full weight of her actions crashed down upon her. The rent was due next week. Her father's physical therapy sessions were $200 an hour. The prescription for his seizure medication was waiting to be filled. The quiet dignity of her exit evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp spike of pure, gut-wrenching panic. What had she done? As she stood on the sidewalk, a ship cast adrift on a sea of uncertainty, the glass door of the Gilded Bean swung open behind her. Marcus Thorne stormed out, his associate trailing nervously in his wake, still babbling apologies. Thorne was radiating a palpable aura of fury, his face a thunderous mask. He was speaking to his associate, his voice sharp and loud enough for Alara to hear clearly over the city noise. "Just get the car," he snapped. "And have the legal team at Thorne Capital on standby. I want to know everything there is to know about that woman. I want to ruin her." The name, Thorne Capital, sliced through the fog of her panic and struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was a name she had tried to burn from her memory, a name that was inextricably linked to the worst day of her life, a name that was scrawled across the top of the legal documents that had systematically dismantled her father's company, his health, and her future. It was a ghost that had haunted her family for years, and now it had a face. The world tilted on its axis. The random, cruel billionaire who had just destroyed her livelihood was not random at all. He was the architect of her family's ruin. The man whose casual cruelty she had challenged was the very same man who had, with the stroke of a pen, signed the order that led to her father's stroke. The cosmic injustice of it was so staggering, so profoundly malevolent, that it stole the air from her lungs. This was not a chance encounter, this was a reckoning. The panic that had been coursing through her veins was instantly vaporized, replaced by a new emotion, something far colder and infinitely more dangerous. It was a crystalline, righteous fury, a purpose so clear and so absolute that it burned away all fear, all doubt, all hesitation. The fight was no longer about a lost job or a wounded pride. It was about reclaiming a stolen life. It was about justice for her father, and in that moment, Alara Vance knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that this was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of a war. A hesitant voice cut through her intense reverie. "Miss, are you okay?" She turned to see Leo, the young intern, standing beside her, his face etched with a mixture of profound concern and boundless admiration. He had followed her out of the cafe, a silent, loyal soldier in a battle he didn't yet understand. "That was the single most incredible thing I have ever witnessed in my entire life," he said, his voice filled with a genuine, heartfelt awe that momentarily broke through her hardened resolve. He looked at her not as a barista but as a hero. He fumbled for words, his gratitude and anger tumbling out in a rush. "Thank you, I mean it." No one has ever stood up to him like that. He's a monster. He treats everyone like they're dirt beneath his shoes. What you did in there, it was justice." His earnestness was a small, warm light in the cold darkness of her new reality. He was a witness. He was a believer. And he was the first person in years who had seen her for who she truly was. She gave him a small, weary smile, the first genuine expression that had crossed her face all day. "Thank you," she said, her voice a little hoarse. "But I'm afraid your idea of justice just cost me my job." He winced, his expression clouding with guilt. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice dropping. I'll see if there's anything I can do. I know people." It was a kind, if naive, offer, the promise of a powerless intern against a wrathful god of finance. But before Ilara could gently dismiss it, he seemed to make a decision. He straightened up, his youthful face set with a new determination. "My name is Leo Croft, by the way." The name meant nothing to her. Just another piece of data in a day filled with overwhelming information. She nodded, about to introduce herself, when he added the words that would change everything. "My older brother is Julian Croft, and he hates Marcus Thorne more than any man on earth." The name, Julian Croft, detonated in Ilara's mind, sending shock waves through her carefully ordered thoughts. Julian Croft was not just another billionaire. He was a legend, a rival titan who had been locked in a brutal, public, and deeply personal corporate war with Marcus Thorne for the better part of a decade. Their rivalry was the stuff of financial news headlines, a clash of two opposing philosophies: Croft, the supposed innovator who built companies, and Thorne, the predator who tore them apart. To have the brother of Marcus Thorne's greatest enemy standing in front of her, offering his help, was not a coincidence. It was an act of providence, a weapon delivered by the very hand of fate. 1,000 possibilities, 1,000 legal strategies, 1,000 pathways to retribution began to bloom in the fertile ground of her mind. The despair that had threatened to consume her just moments ago was gone, replaced by the electric hum of a plan beginning to form. She looked at Leo Croft, really looked at him for the first time. She saw past the nervous intern and saw the key. He was the insider, the access point, the unexpected variable in an equation that had, until now, been hopelessly unbalanced. The cold, calculating part of her brain, the part that had excelled at Stanford, took over. The part that could see 10 moves ahead on a chessboard of corporate intrigue. Her voice, when she spoke again, was different. The weariness was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused intensity that made Leo straighten his shoulders and listen with his full attention. "Leo," she said, her tone now that of a general addressing her lieutenant, "I need you to do more than just talk to your brother. I need you to get me a meeting with him. And I need you to tell me everything you know about Marcus Thorne. Everything." The war had begun, and Ilara Vance had just found her first soldier. They left the shadows of the Gilded Beam behind, walking away from the scene of Ilara's professional demise and into the uncertain territory of their new alliance. The bustling streets of Manhattan, usually a source of overwhelming anonymity, now felt like a landscape of opportunity. Every skyscraper seemed to hold a secret, every passing limousine a potential clue. They found a small, unassuming diner a few blocks away, its worn vinyl booths and the smell of grease and stale coffee, a universe away from the marble and mahogany they had just left. The stark contrast was not lost on Ilara. She had spent years serving the 1% in their gilded cage, and now, sitting in a humble booth with a cracked Formica tabletop, she was finally plotting how to tear that cage apart. The fluorescent lights overhead were harsh and unflattering, but in their unforgiving glare, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. There were no more masks to wear, no more roles to play. There was only the mission. As they sipped their watery coffee from thick ceramic mugs, the story of her past came pouring out. She told Leo everything, not for sympathy, but for context, laying out the facts of her case with the dispassionate precision of a lawyer briefing a client. She spoke of her father's small tech company, Vance Innovations, of its groundbreaking work in data compression algorithms. She described the man her father had been before the takeover, vibrant, brilliant, a force of creative energy. Then she detailed the brutal, systematic way Thorn Capital had descended, using tactics she now understood with a chilling clarity: the short selling, the proxy battles, the spreading of market rumors. It was the exact same playbook Thorn had been boasting about in the cafe, a signature method of corporate destruction. She explained how the financial ruin had led directly to her father's stroke, the stress of losing his life's work literally breaking his body and his spirit. She laid it all bare, connecting the dots between the monster in the cafe and the ghost haunting her family. Leo listened with a rapt, horrified attention, his youthful face a canvas of escalating outrage. He had known Thorn was a ruthless businessman, but hearing the intimate, human cost of that ruthlessness was something else entirely. He saw the direct line between Thorn's actions and the quiet, dignified pain in Alara's eyes. When she finished her story, he was silent for a long moment, the clatter and chatter of the diner fading into a distant hum. Then he spoke, his voice low and firm with a newfound resolve. "My brother will help you," he said, with an absolute certainty that surprised even himself. This is exactly the kind of thing he's been trying to fight. Thorn doesn't just beat his competition, he salts the earth. He destroys lives for sport. Julian has been looking for a way to prove what kind of man Thorn really is, to expose him for the criminal he is. You're not just looking for revenge, Alara. You're the smoking gun he's been waiting for. He then began to paint a picture of the rivalry between his brother and Thorn, giving Alara the strategic intelligence she would need to navigate the treacherous waters ahead. He described Julian Croft not as a saint, but as a fiercely competitive and brilliant strategist who had built his empire from the ground up, in direct opposition to Thorn's tear-down and sell-off model. He explained that their enmity was not just business, it was personal. Thorn had once tried to orchestrate a hostile takeover of Croft Industries early in Julian's career, a move that had almost bankrupted him and had cemented a lifelong hatred. Thorn represented everything Julian despised: inherited wealth, destructive capitalism, and a profound lack of ethics. The meeting was arranged not in a boardroom, but in a private library on the top floor of the Croft Industries Tower, a space that felt more like a modern monastery than a corporate headquarters. The room was a stark contrast to the oppressive opulence of the Gilded Bean. Here, floor-to-ceiling windows framed a breathtaking, panoramic view of Central Park, the autumn foliage, a vibrant tapestry of gold and crimson against the city's gray steel. The walls were lined not with mahogany, but with pale, unvarnished oak, filled with thousands of books on history, philosophy, and science. The air smelled of old paper and clean, filtered oxygen, a scent of intellect rather than just wealth. Julian Croft was nothing like the caricature of the vengeful billionaire Alara had half expected. He was younger than Thorn, with a lean, athletic build and an air of restless energy. He wore no suit, just a simple gray cashmere sweater and dark trousers. His eyes, however, were sharp and analytical, missing nothing. He didn't offer platitudes or false sympathy. Instead, he listened, his gaze fixed on Alara as she laid out the facts, his stillness a testament to his focus. He was a predator, yes, but of a different kind. He was a builder, and he recognized in her the mind of a fellow architect, albeit one whose blueprints were for justice, not skyscrapers. He let the silence hang in the air for a long moment after she finished her story, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He was assessing her, weighing her resolve, searching for the slightest hint of weakness or emotional liability. He had seen countless people broken by Marcus Thorn over the years, their spirits crushed, their fight extinguished. But he saw something different in Alara Vance. He saw a cold, unyielding fire, an intellect that had been tempered in the crucible of personal tragedy. He saw a weapon that had been left to rust but was now being sharpened to a lethal edge. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and devoid of emotion, a statement of fact rather than an offer of help. Thorne's greatest weakness, he said, his eyes locking with hers, is his pathological inability to see value in anything he cannot acquire. He sees people as liabilities or assets, nothing more. He saw you as a barista. He failed to see the Stanford-trained legal mind. That is the kind of oversight that destroys empires. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to her, gazing down at the city he and Thorne both considered their kingdom. I will give you access to our entire legal research division. Every database, every analyst, every resource is yours. I will not fight this battle for you, Ms. Vance. But I will provide you with the armory. Find the proof. Find the crime he buried all those years ago. Bring me the evidence to remove him from the board, and I will ensure you have the stage to do it. The days that followed were a blur of immersion, a baptism by fire back into the world she had been forced to abandon. Julian Croft's legal research division was a technological marvel, a quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary of information located 3 floors below his library. It was a place where the only sound was the gentle hum of servers and the soft clicking of keyboards. For Alara, stepping into that room was like coming home. The scent of ozone from the servers, the cool, recycled air, the rows of glowing monitors displaying endless streams of data, it all awakened a part of her that had been dormant for 3 long years. The muscle memory of her legal training returned with a startling swiftness. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her mind navigating the complex architecture of legal databases and financial archives with an instinctual grace. The analysts assigned to assist her, at first skeptical of the former barista, quickly fell silent, their expressions shifting to awe as they watched her work. She was not just searching for data, she was conducting a symphony, pulling disparate threads of information from a dozen different sources and weaving them together into a coherent narrative of corporate malfeasance. She was a prodigy rediscovering her gift, and the object of her focus was the complete and utter deconstruction of Marcus Thorne. She began with the public record, a mountain of SEC filings, shareholder reports, and press releases related to Thorne Capital's acquisition of Vance Innovations. For 72 straight hours, fueled by black coffee and a righteous fury, she read every line, every footnote, every boilerplate legal disclaimer. To an outside observer, it was a dry, impenetrable wall of text. To Alara, it was a crime scene, and she was the forensic investigator dusting for fingerprints. She saw the patterns emerge, the subtle tells in the language of the documents. She noted the sudden, unexplained drop in Vance Innovations' stock price in the weeks leading up to the takeover bid, a classic sign of a coordinated short-selling attack. She traced the purchase of large blocks of shares through a series of newly created limited liability companies, all registered in Delaware with anonymous ownership structures, a clear attempt to circumvent the 5% disclosure rule she had quoted back at the cafe. She saw how Thorne had used his immense media influence to plant negative stories about her father's management, creating a narrative of instability that spooked investors and drove the price down even further. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, a masterclass in legally ambiguous corporate warfare. She compiled a dossier hundreds of pages thick, a meticulous, undeniable timeline of Thorne's predatory strategy. She cross-referenced trading logs with the dates of the negative press releases, showing a clear correlation. She mapped out the network of shell companies, demonstrating how they were all funded from a single offshore account linked back to a known subsidiary of Thorne Capital. The case she was building was academically brilliant, a perfect dissection of a hostile takeover. Julian Croft's own legal team reviewed her findings with a mixture of admiration and professional envy. It was, they concluded, the most thorough analysis of Thorne's methods they had ever seen. But as Alara stared at the finished report, a cold feeling of dissatisfaction settled in her gut. She had proven that Thorne was a ruthless, unethical monster. She had exposed the morally bankrupt tactics he used to destroy her father. But she hadn't found the smoking gun. Everything he had done, as vile as it was, existed in a legal gray area. expertly designed by his army of lawyers to be just on the right side of the law. She had a mountain of circumstantial evidence, but she lacked the one piece of irrefutable proof of criminal intent that would not just oust him, but imprison him. The system was designed to protect men like Thorne, and she had just hit a wall of reinforced concrete. The frustration was a physical ache, a tightness in her chest that made it hard to breathe. For a moment, the sheer scale of the challenge threatened to overwhelm her. Thorne was a fortress, his crimes protected by layers of legal armor and a fortune built on the ruins of 1,000 other families like hers. The image of her father, sitting silently in his wheelchair, his eyes vacant, flashed in her mind. The despair was a tempting poison, whispering to her that this was a fool's errand, that the world was not a place where justice prevailed. She closed her eyes, forcing the image away, and replaced it with another. Marcus Thorne's sneering, arrogant face in the cafe. The memory of his condescending voice, the casual cruelty of his dismissal, was the antidote to her despair. The anger returned, cold and clean, burning away the doubt. He had made a mistake. His fatal error was not in his business dealings, but in his personal arrogance. He had underestimated her. He had assumed she was nothing, and in doing so, he had created the one enemy with the intellect and the motivation to bring him down. She would not be stopped by a legal firewall. If the documents wouldn't give her the crime, she would have to find the person who would. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Leo. He had been her constant source of support, a lifeline to the world outside the hermetically sealed research division. He called every day, his voice a mixture of youthful enthusiasm and genuine concern. "How's the war room?" he asked, his tone light but his underlying meaning serious. Ilara sighed, rubbing her temples. "I've built a beautiful, comprehensive case proving that Marcus Thorne is a terrible human being," she said, her voice laced with exhaustion. "Unfortunately, being a terrible human being isn't a federal crime. I'm missing the link, Leo. The one piece of evidence that proves he knowingly and intentionally broke the law." There was a pause on the other end of the line. She could hear him thinking, his mind sifting through the memories of his brief, traumatic tenure at Thorne Capital. He had been a low-level intern, privy to almost nothing of substance, but he had been observant. He remembered the people, the atmosphere of fear that permeated the office, the whispers in the hallways. He remembered the hushed, nervous conversations around the time of a major internal audit, an audit that had coincided, he now realized, with the final stages of the Vance Innovations takeover. "There was a guy," Leo said, his voice hesitant, as if pulling a half-forgotten memory from a deep well. "An older man in the accounting department. His name was Arthur Pence. He was quiet, kept to himself. Everyone said he was a genius with numbers, the only one who really understood Thorne's creative accounting methods. He was let go right after the Vance deal was finalized. The official story was that he took early retirement, but the rumor was that Thorne pushed him out. I remember seeing him leave. He looked haunted, like he'd seen a ghost. He wouldn't look anyone in the eye." The name, Arthur Pence, lit a fire in Ilara's mind. This was it. This was the human element, the potential weak link in Thorne's armor. A man who knew where the bodies were buried, because he had been forced to dig the graves. A man haunted by his complicity. A man who might, just might, be convinced to talk. The hunt had a new target. The fortress had a potential side door, and Arthur Pence was the key. Finding Arthur Pence proved to be an almost impossible task. The man had vanished. He was a ghost in the digital age, with no social media presence, no current credit card activity, no updated driver's license. He had seemingly dropped off the face of the earth after leaving Thorne Capital. Ilara understood why. A man with his knowledge would be a liability to Marcus Thorne, and Thorne was not a man who tolerated liabilities. Pence was not just retired, he was hiding, terrified of the retribution that would surely follow if he ever spoke out. For 3 days, Ilara and a team of private investigators hired by Julian Croft chased down cold leads. They ran his social security number, checked property records in all 50 states, and cross-referenced his name with every conceivable public database. Nothing. It was as if he had ceased to exist. The frustration began to build again, the walls closing in. But Alara refused to give up. She went back to the beginning, to the last known data point, his employment records from Thorn Capital. She found his original application from over 20 years ago. It was mostly useless, filled with outdated addresses and disconnected phone numbers. But in a small box at the bottom, under Emergency Contact, was a single name, an older sister long since deceased. It was a long shot, a desperate grasp at a single, frayed thread. But it was all she had. Using the sister's name, she dove into probate court records, searching for her will, for any mention of her brother. After hours of scrolling through digitized legal documents, she found it. In the will, the sister had bequeathed a small, remote piece of property to her beloved brother, Arthur. It was a secluded 2-acre plot of land with a small cabin, deep in the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. There was no mortgage on the property. It had been owned by their family for generations. He could live there entirely off the grid, paying the minimal property taxes in cash once a year at the local county office. He had built himself a fortress of solitude, a refuge from the modern world and from the long shadow of Marcus Thorn. Alara looked at the satellite image of the dense, unending forest, a single tiny structure barely visible among the trees. She had found him. Now she had to convince a man who had spent years running from the truth to turn around and face it. The drive upstate was a journey into another world. The steel and glass canyons of Manhattan gave way to rolling hills and, finally, to the dense primeval forest of the Adirondacks. The air grew crisp and cool, smelling of pine and damp earth. She followed a series of winding, poorly maintained roads until the pavement disappeared altogether, replaced by a dirt track that was little more than 2 ruts in the ground. She left the car at the end of the track and walked the final half-mile, the silence of the forest broken only by the crunch of her footsteps on fallen leaves and the distant call of a bird. The cabin was small and unassuming, with a curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. It looked like a place of peace, but Alara could feel the tension radiating from it, the palpable fear of a man living in a self-imposed prison. She knocked on the heavy wooden door, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound quiet. For a long moment, there was no answer. Then, the door creaked open a few inches, and a pair of terrified eyes peered out at her from the shadows. Arthur Pence looked older than his years, his face a roadmap of anxiety, his hair a wild shock of white. He looked at her with the panicked expression of a cornered animal. He tried to slam the door, but Alara was ready. She put her hand flat against the wood, holding it open. "Please, Mr. Pence," she said, her voice calm and steady, devoid of any threat. "My name is Alara Vance. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to ask for your help." The name Vance registered in his eyes, a flicker of horrified recognition. He knew who she was. He knew what she represented. His face went pale, and he began to tremble. "Go away," he rasped, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I don't know anything. I have nothing to say to you." He pushed against the door, his frail strength. No match for her steady pressure. Alara didn't try to force her way in. Instead, she changed her tactic, appealing not to his fear, but to the guilt she saw etched so plainly on his face. "He didn't just destroy a company, Mr. Pence," she said, her voice dropping, becoming more personal, more intimate. "He destroyed my father. He took a brilliant, vibrant man and left him in a wheelchair, unable to speak, unable to even feed himself. You helped him do that. I know you were just following orders, that you were trapped. But the man my father was deserves justice, and you are the only person on earth who can help give it to him." She saw the conflict warring in his eyes, the terror of Marcus Thorn on one side and the crushing weight of his own conscience on the other. He had lived with this guilt for years, letting it fester in the silence and solitude of his cabin. Her words were a lance, piercing the abscess of his long-suppressed morality. He looked at her, at this young woman whose life had been irrevocably damaged by a series of numbers he himself had manipulated on a spreadsheet. He saw in her eyes not a threat, but a chance, a final, terrifying opportunity for redemption. The fight went out of him. His shoulders slumped, and he stepped back from the door, a silent invitation to enter. The inside of the cabin was Spartan and meticulously clean, but it felt suffocating, the air thick with regret. He sank into a worn armchair by the fireplace, his head in his hands. He was right to be afraid, he whispered, his voice cracking. You have no idea what Thorn is capable of. He will destroy me. He'll destroy anyone who gets in his way. He has erased every trace of what he did. There is no proof. That's where you're wrong, Mr. Pence, Alara said softly, taking a seat opposite him. She spent the next hour explaining everything. She told him about Julian Croft, about the resources at her disposal, about the comprehensive legal protection he would be afforded. She explained that he would be designated as a whistleblower, shielded by federal law, and that Croft's personal security team would ensure his safety. She was not asking him to be a martyr. She was offering him a way out, a path to reclaim his life from the shadow of fear he had been living under. She was offering him a way to finally sleep at night. He listened, his expression slowly changing from one of terror to one of dawning, hesitant hope. For the first time in years, he saw a future that was not defined by his fear of Marcus Thorn. He saw a glimmer of a world where the truth might actually matter. His resolve, eroded by years of guilt, finally crumbled completely. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a profound, weary sadness, and nodded. He rose from his chair and walked to a heavy ironwood stove in the corner of the room. He knelt down and, with trembling hands, pried loose a single, scorched brick from the hearth behind it. From the dark cavity, he pulled out a small, metal object wrapped in oilcloth. It was an external hard drive, an older model but one that had been carefully preserved. He unwrapped it and held it out to Alara, his hand shaking so violently she had to steady it with her own. This, he said, his voice barely audible, is my confession. Thorn was brilliant. He never put anything in writing. But he was also arrogant. He liked to keep trophies. He made me maintain a second set of books, a shadow ledger that detailed the entire Vance operation. The offshore accounts, the illegal fund transfers, the payments to journalists to plant negative stories. It was all a game to him, a way to admire his own handiwork. He thought it was all safely deleted, but I made a copy. I've kept it all these years, my own personal hell. The hard drive felt impossibly heavy in Alara's hand. It was not just a piece of technology. It was the key to Thorn's kingdom, the irrefutable proof of his crimes, the smoking gun she had been so desperately searching for. It was the physical manifestation of justice. The journey back to the city was a surreal experience. The setting sun cast long shadows across the highway, and Alara drove with a focus so intense she barely noticed the miles flying by. The hard drive sat on the passenger seat beside her, a silent, powerful passenger. The weight of its contents was immense, a burden and a blessing all at once. She felt no elation, no sense of triumphant victory. Instead, she felt a profound, solemn sense of purpose. The long, agonizing years of her father's silence were about to be answered. The invisible, forgotten Barista was about to become the architect of a Titan's downfall. The fight was no longer a desperate scramble for evidence. It was now about planning the execution. The question was no longer if she could win, but how she would choose to deliver the final, devastating blow. The rage that had fueled her for so long was now cooling, solidifying into a core of pure, unshakable resolve. She was no longer a victim seeking revenge. She was an instrument of justice, and she was about to bring a reckoning. Back in the Croft Industries tower, the atmosphere was electric. Julian Croft's top cybersecurity team took the hard drive and, within an hour, bypassed Arthur Pence's amateur encryption. The contents of the drive were displayed on a massive screen in the research division's central hub. It was everything Pence had promised and more. Detailed spreadsheets, illicit bank statements from Cayman Islands accounts, damning email chains between Thorne and his inner circle, where he openly mocked her father and celebrated the collapse of his company. It was a complete, unvarnished portrait of a criminal conspiracy. Julian Croft stood beside Alara, watching the evidence scroll by, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "This is more than enough to remove him," he said, his voice a low growl of satisfaction. "This is enough to bury him." He turned to her, his eyes gleaming with respect. "The Thorne Capital annual shareholder meeting is in 2 weeks. It's his grand stage, the one day a year he plays the benevolent king for his investors. I have secured you a proxy vote, Ms. Vance. The floor will be yours." The stage was now set. The players were in position. Alara looked at the screen, at the cold, hard data that represented her family's pain, and felt the last vestiges of Alara the barista fall away forever. All that remained was the prosecutor, ready to deliver her closing argument to the world. The ballroom of the Grand Hyatt was a universe of calculated opulence, a temple built to celebrate the unholy trinity of profit, power, and perception. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and catered hors d'oeuvre, a sterile corporate perfume that failed to mask the underlying odor of ravenous ambition. On a massive stage, bathed in the cool, unforgiving glow of theatrical lighting, Marcus Thorne stood at a sleek, minimalist lectern, a modern-day emperor addressing his legions. He was in his element, his voice a smooth, confident baritone that resonated through the cavernous space, speaking of record earnings and aggressive growth projections. The shareholders, a sea of dark suits and muted power dresses, listened with a placid, bovine contentment, their faces illuminated by the glow of the massive screens behind Thorne that displayed rising stock charts and glowing testimonials. They were not here for oversight, they were here for reassurance, to be told that the golden calf they worshipped was fatter and healthier than ever. And in the middle of this congregation, seated in the 17th row, was Alara Vance. She was an island of absolute stillness, in an ocean of polite applause, her presence an anomaly, a single, discordant note in a symphony of self-congratulation. In her hand she clutched a single piece of paper, a proxy vote, that was her ticket to this stage. In her mind, she held the image of her father, not as the broken man in the wheelchair, but as the vibrant giant of her childhood, his laughter, a sound she would give anything to hear one last time. The floor was opened for the customary question-and-answer session, a carefully choreographed piece of corporate theater designed to give the illusion of transparency. Hands went up, and Thorne pointed languidly at familiar faces, a friendly analyst here, a major institutional investor there. The questions were softballs, inquiries about dividend yields and market penetration, each one a perfectly placed tee for Thorne to hit another home run of corporate rhetoric. He was enjoying himself, the smug, condescending smirk she remembered from the cafe playing on his lips as he effortlessly dispatched each query. He was a master of this world, a predator at the absolute apex of his food chain. Then, a single steady hand rose from the middle of the room. It was not a hand he recognized. It did not belong to a fund manager or a fawning journalist. It belonged to a young woman in a simple, dark blue dress, a woman who met his gaze with an unnerving, unblinking intensity. An assistant with a wireless microphone, sensing a deviation from the script, hesitated, but the quiet, undeniable authority in Alara's posture compelled him forward. He navigated the aisle and handed her the microphone, a simple act that felt, to the entire room, like the passing of a torch. The low hum of contented chatter in the ballroom died away, replaced by a sudden, curious silence. Thorne leaned forward slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face, impatient to dispense with this unknown variable and return to his victory lap. Alara rose to her feet, the microphone feeling cool and solid in her hand. The harsh stage lights were blinding, but she did not see the crowd of 1,000 faces. She saw only one. Her heart was not racing with fear, but beating with a slow, powerful, and deliberate rhythm, the steady drumbeat of a war that was about to reach its conclusion. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the voice of a barista. It was the voice that had once dominated mock trial competitions. A voice of crystalline clarity and resonant power that needed no amplification to command the room's absolute attention. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thorne," she began, her tone even and professional. "My name is Alara Vance." The name hung in the air, meaningless to the audience, but to the man on the stage it was a ghost from a forgotten grave. A flicker of confusion, then a dawning, horrified recognition passed across his features. He remembered her. The barista. The insolent girl from the coffee shop. A dark flush of anger began to creep up his neck. Before he could formulate a dismissive retort, before he could order security to remove her for trespassing on his sacred ground, she delivered the next line, and the foundation of his world began to crack. "I am the daughter of Robert Vance, the founder and former CEO of Vance Innovations." The silence in the room was now absolute, a heavy, weighted blanket of shock and anticipation. The shareholders stirred, a ripple of unease passing through the crowd. This was not on the agenda. This was not part of the show. This was something real. "I don't have a question for you, Mr. Thorne," Alara continued, her voice as sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "I have an indictment. On the screens behind you, you've presented a compelling narrative of financial success. Allow me to present a different narrative. A narrative of fraud, market manipulation, and criminal conspiracy." With a single click of a small remote in her hand, the glowing stock charts and corporate logos on the massive screens behind Thorne vanished. They were replaced by something else entirely. A scanned document appeared, its title clear for everyone in the room to see. The Shadow Ledger of Thorne Capital, Fiscal Year 2018. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. The screen then split, showing a side-by-side comparison. On one side, the official SEC-filed accounting for the Vance Innovations takeover, and on the other, the real numbers from Arthur Pence's hard drive. The illegal wire transfers to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The meticulously documented payments to financial journalists to publish false negative reports. The email chains where Thorne himself, in language dripping with arrogant contempt, outlined the strategy to artificially deflate her father's stock and trigger a panic sell. She walked them through it all, her voice a cold, dispassionate metronome of facts. Each sentence a hammer blow against the crumbling edifice of his reputation. She was not just telling a story, she was reading the minutes of his corporate death sentence, using his own words, his own numbers, his own hubris as the undeniable evidence. Marcus Thorne stood frozen on the stage, a statue carved from pure terror. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly, waxy pallor. The confident baritone was gone, replaced by a strangled, rasping sound in his throat as he tried and failed to form a denial. The microphone in his hand trembled, his knuckles white. He looked out at the sea of faces, his shareholders, his allies, his sycophants, and saw not adoration, but 1,000 pairs of accusing eyes. The reporters at the press tables were no longer politely taking notes. They were a frenzy of activity, their cameras flashing like strobe lights, capturing every bead of sweat that trickled down his temple, every twitch of the panicked muscle in his jaw. He was a king stripped naked in his own court, his crimes projected in high definition for the entire world to see. He tried to speak, to lash out, to call it a lie, a fabrication. All that came out was a pathetic, gurgling sound. He gestured wildly to the wings, a desperate, silent plea for his staff, for security, for anyone to make it stop. But no one moved. The board members seated behind him were slowly, deliberately pushing their chairs back, creating a physical distance, a visible quarantine from the contagion of his downfall. He was utterly, completely alone, exposed and consumed by the bright, hot lights of a hell entirely of his own making. The Titan had fallen, and the sound of his impact was the deafening silence of 1,000 broken allegiances. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Alara Vance finally exposed the truth. The chaos that erupted in the ballroom was immediate and total. Shareholders were shouting, reporters were screaming questions, and the members of the board were scrambling for the exits like rats from a sinking ship. But Ilara saw none of it. She placed the microphone gently on an empty chair in front of her and walked out of the ballroom, her task complete. She did not feel the triumphant elation of victory, nor the bitter satisfaction of revenge. She felt only a profound, quiet sense of closure, a deep, settling peace. The next few days were a blur of headlines, each one more damning than the last. Thorn Empire crumbles. SEC launches full-scale investigation. The Barista WHO toppled a billionaire. The stock price of Thorn Capital did not just fall, it ceased to exist, delisted from the exchange in a matter of hours. But Ilara paid it little mind. Her final act of justice took place not in a boardroom, but in a quiet, sunlit room, in a long-term care facility. She sat beside her father's wheelchair, holding his hand, the one that still had some feeling left in it. She didn't show him the newspaper clippings or the cable news reports. She simply told him, her voice soft and steady, "It's over, Dad. He's gone. The man who hurt you, who hurt our family, he can't hurt anyone ever again. We're safe now." For a long moment, he gave no reaction. Then, she felt a faint, almost imperceptible pressure on her fingers. A single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek, and for the first time in 3 years, she saw a flicker of the old light return to his eyes, a silent acknowledgement, a final, peaceful closing of a painful chapter. A week later, she found herself once again on the top floor of a skyscraper, but this one felt different. She was in Julian Croft's office, the late afternoon sun casting long golden rays across the city. He had been true to his word, providing the armor and the stage, but allowing her to fight the battle herself. In a move that dominated the business news cycle, Croft Industries had acquired the now bankrupt Gilded Bean coffee chain for pennies on the dollar. His first official act as the new owner was announced in a press release that morning. Ilara Vance, it read, has been rehired. He slid a folder across the polished oak desk toward her. It was a contract. "I believe this belongs to you," he said, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. "It's not an offer to be a barista." She opened the folder. The title on the top of the page read, Senior Vice President, Head of the Croft Foundation's new Corporate Ethics and Justice Initiative. The salary was astronomical, but it was the job description that made her breath catch in her throat. She would be given a multi-billion-dollar endowment and a simple, sweeping mandate to seek out and fund the legal battles of individuals and small companies being crushed by predatory corporate giants. She would not just be preventing future Marcus Thorns, she would be actively hunting them. It was not a job, it was a calling. It was the future that had been stolen from her, returned 1,000-fold. She looked up from the contract, her eyes meeting his. She saw no pity in his gaze, only a deep and profound respect. "The world needs more watchdogs," he said simply, "and you're the best I've ever seen." Ilara closed the folder, a sense of rightness settling deep in her bones. The rage was gone, the grief had softened, and in their place was a vast, open landscape of purpose. She had started this journey to save her father, but in the end, she had also saved herself. She had rediscovered the brilliant, formidable woman who had been buried beneath an apron and a mountain of medical bills. She was no longer a victim of a broken system. She was now one of its most powerful and dedicated architects of change. Her father's legacy would not be one of ruin, but of a renewed fight for justice, a fight she would now lead. The quiet barista who served coffee to the gods of finance was gone forever. In her place stood a guardian, ready to ensure that the arrogant and the powerful would always have to think twice before underestimating the person pouring their coffee. The scales of justice had finally been balanced, not by a court of law, but by the unyielding will of a daughter who refused to let her father's story end in tragedy. If Ilara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.